right. Thank you very much. We are about to get started with our second panel, and I am delighted to welcome Admiral Fogo and our distinguished speakers back to the stage. Without further ado, Admiral Fogo, the floor is yours.
Dr. Pincus, thank you so much. Wow. That was a fantastic first panel, and big shoes to fill for us, gentlemen. As we move into, it was kind of a policy side. Many of our civilian leaders, excellent job of moderating by Commander Gosnell, but now we have an all-uniform panel here, and hopefully you'll see that naval forces, including Coast Guard, are the extended arm of diplomacy. So I am joined by four distinguished leaders today, and I want to give you their background first, and then we're going to go down the list, starting with Admiral Cottle to talk about some issues, and at the end, we'll reserve about 15 minutes for questions. So I'll start with Admiral Darrell Cottle, four-star commander of U.S. Navy Fleet Forces Command based in Norfolk, Virginia. I can see him nodding, so that means he can hear me, and that's good, because I know he's broadcasting from his beautiful home down there in Virginia House in Virginia. Admiral Cottle is the primary naval force providing authority for the entire Atlantic, European, and African regions. He's a career submariner who commanded at all levels of the submarine force and now is commanding at the very highest levels of Navy Component Command. He's even got a Ph.D. in cyber studies. I mean, this guy is brilliant. And before taking over Fleet Forces, he was the Vice Director for Strategy, Plans, and Policy, J5 on the Joint Staff. But he was also my Submarine Group 8. That's a position that I occupied as well while I was the Commander of Naval Forces Europe. And he was absolutely brilliant at the basics and everything else. And I got to tell you, the one thing, when you take off the uniform, it's tough, because I really wish I was back in the fight. But you always look back on what is your legacy. Darrell represents one of those very fine officers who I consider to be a legacy, who followed me and who we worked together with. Another one is Admiral Dwyer, Admiral Franchetti, Admiral Jim Aiken, who is the 4th Fleet Commander, and Admiral Bill Houston, who is the Submarine Force Commander. All started in that incubator of flag leadership out there in Naples, Italy. So if you're a naval officer out there living, you better ask your detailer for orders to Naples so you can relieve one of these guys. The second in the order today is Vice Admiral Dan Dozier Dwyer. He is 2nd Fleet Commander, vast responsibility that spans from the Arctic and the North Atlantic approaches to Europe, all the way down to the Cape of Good Hope. Dan is an FA-18 aviator who commanded at the squadron level, the carrier air wing, and the carrier strike group levels. He had to go through nuclear power school and prototype training late in his career. It was tough for me as an ensign right out of the Naval Academy. I can't imagine doing that after being a squadron commander as a commander in the Navy, but he excelled, and he earned command of USS Theodore Roosevelt. He also went to Top Gun, ladies and gents, but he wasn't just a student at Top Gun. He was the Top Gun. So when you're looking at this guy, think Iceman. Remember, Iceman won the trophy, and so did Dan, not Tom Cruise. But that being said, Tom Cruise and the cast were on the Theodore Roosevelt for 2 weeks at sea while they were filming, and Dan was the commander of that strike group. So I think that is really cool. He also worked in Naples as the J5 for plans, policy, and strategy. He was traveling all over Europe and Africa for me, and I'm delighted that you could take time out of your busy schedule to come up and join us today. Next, Vice Admiral Kevin Lunday. So, U.S. Coast Guard Atlantic Area Commander. His responsibility is even larger than Admiral Dwyer's and extends into the continental United States as well for Homeland Defense. Admiral Lunday has served in a variety of operational intelligence and legal assignments in the Coast Guard and the joint community, including command afloat and ashore. He holds a law degree from George Washington University and has spent a lot of time in his career protecting critical infrastructure, all the things that we talked about in the last panel, and especially cyber infrastructure. And with that law degree, I would expect that as a Coast Guard officer, he's an expert on the UN Convention on Law of the Sea. So, Kevin, thanks for being a part of our panel today. And last but not least, the newest flag officer in the lot here is Rear Admiral Anthony Remington, Royal Navy. Now, Anthony has been a flag officer for 3 months, And let me tell you, he's a rotary wing Lynx Wildcat helicopter pilot. He flew in last night from the UK, went immediately with the naval attaché, Commodore Redwine, to an embassy event, stayed up late, had a few Guinnesses, got up this morning, had a full schedule of calls throughout Washington. He's doing this panel, and he's getting on a plane this afternoon, late tonight, and flying back to the UK so he can be part of a ceremony tomorrow where the United States government presents some meritorious service medals to Royal Navy officers. Now that is youthful exuberance and tenacity, and I hope you don't run out of gas. So thanks very much for being here with us. He was integral in the development and deployment of HMS Queen Elizabeth and the HMS Prince of Wales. My friend Jerry Kidd was the first CO on Queen Elizabeth, invited me to the commissioning. I got to tell you, Jerry was the defrocked admiral who became a captain to be the captain of that ship. That's a long story. But I'll tell you that as a matter of friendship and the link between us, because we're special allies, the first thing I gave him when I got to the ship was a bottle of Kentucky 4-Rose bourbon. So a little Kentucky rose for the English rose. He put it in the wardroom. The wardroom had just been finished. It was magnificent. A couple guys in kilts came in from a ceremony, and that bottle drained in about 30 minutes. So I felt pretty good about that. Anyway, without any further ado, on to Admiral Cottle. Admiral Cottle, I wonder if you today, and I'm just going to fire a few things at you and then turn you loose, Daryl, would give us your perspective on deterrence in the Arctic region. Like, what does it mean to deter in the Arctic? And, you know, there's a lot of discussion about, is the Navy ready to do that? Is the Coast Guard ready to do that? So to deter, and with what? What are you going to deter with? What are some of the tools at your disposal as a Navy component commander, which is a pretty big deal? I mean, you basically got, you know, a third of all naval forces in the world with the other components in the Pacific and Europe. And while you're at it, because you are a very studied and learned individual, can you give us kind of an overview of why the Arctic is strategically important and economically important? And that's really why the Russians are paranoid about it, because that's a significant portion of their oil and gas. And lastly, it's kind of a fun thing, and I know I put this up front earlier, but we're going to save it for last because we've got to talk about strategy first. We do an ice camp up there, which is really cool, and I've been part of that in the past. You know, when you surface the submarine, we actually have people who go up there and plant tents and stay for a couple of weeks. Daryl was part of this event last year in Ice Camp Queenfish, named after a submarine that spent a heck of a lot of time in the Arctic. And I wonder if you could just tell us what it's like to be up there, exposed to the elements, the polar bears and the Arctic foxes for a couple of weeks. And what do we get out of it? Why do we do that? And what's the periodicity? So, sir, I throw the football to you in Norfolk.
Hey, Admiral Fogo, give me a thumbs up if you hear me okay.
We got you.
Okay. Well, first of all, for the listeners, I would be remiss if I didn't mention two things. One, Jamie Fogo is an icon in the submarine force and in the broader Navy. And so it's an honor to be part of a panel that he's monitoring. He's also a very close friend. And second, between Vice Admiral Dwyer and Lundry and myself, you're looking at about 3/4 of the task force that's actually doing high altitude balloon recovery operations. So one of the reasons I'm not there in person is working with the team to conduct those operations off the coast of South Carolina as we speak. So anyway, I am thrilled to be here. And when I got asked to be part of a deterrence panel, you know, it hits me that many times when I sit in meetings, I'll get this question: can we deter Russia? Can we deter China? And I think it's important that we have to be very clear that we have to ask, deter them from doing what? Okay, deter them from launching a nuclear weapon, perhaps deter them from illegally entering another country and conducting combat operations, maybe deterring them from partnering with undesirable other countries, maybe deter them from surveilling or disrupting our critical infrastructure from seabed to space, perhaps deterring them from operating and making illegal claims in the Arctic, or perhaps just deterring them from approaching our country within range of unaccountable strategic weapons. So it's important to put a point on what exactly we are trying to do in that phrase, deterring Russia. And then, as Admiral Fogo talked about, we have to think about what are we going to use to actually implement that deterrence strategy. As you know, deterrence broadly is imposing costs and denying benefits. And you got to do that with the will, a credible will and capability, and do it at the right timing and effect. So you can think of levers of our national power. We often talk about soft and smart power options, diplomatic, economic, alliance and partner capacity building options. But today in this panel, we perhaps need to drill down further and talk about the levers of military power: demonstrated, persistent, credible, tailored, thoughtful, scalable, coordinated, and coupled with other deterrence instruments. And that's where the team in front of you today come in. So I guess I would, end this part by saying it's not useful to just ask the general question, can we deter Russia, PRC, or North Korea, without the underlying questions in order to build a corresponding deterrent strategy and determine the required measures of performance and effectiveness to monitor that performance, establish stakeholder buy-in, and the expectations of the desired objectives. I'll shift now. Let me talk a little bit about the stakes here. And as Admiral Fogo talked about, let me talk a little bit about the size and scale of the area and the importance of it. Economically, 1 million square miles of U.S. territorial waters and economic zone, $3 billion of Alaska's Arctic seafood industry, 90 billion barrels of oil reserves, and estimated 30% of the world's undiscovered natural gas, over $1 trillion in rare earth minerals. And the Northern Sea Route offers a 35-day transit from the South China Sea to the Mediterranean, cutting off 2 weeks shorter than the Suez and Malaccan Strait transit route does. So yes, this is an important region. So what's changed since 2013? Well, Russia's changed. 6 bases, 14 airfields, 16 deep water ports, 14 icebreakers built. China, 6 Arctic expeditions, over 10 million tons of goods transited the Northern Sea Route yearly, with 40% of those vessels originating from or destined to China. And in 2018, we conducted a very large NATO exercise, Trident Juncture, where over 31 countries, over 50,000 service members. And then, as Admiral Fogo mentioned, we do a biennial ISEX every year with the Submarine Force. And the number of partners and capabilities that we demonstrate in the ice during that period grows each year. In fact, since the 2013 time, we've done 5 of those. I've been involved in 3. And in 1996, I personally was involved as an engineer on the USS Sandlance, where I conducted 40 ice surfacings. So later I can answer questions on more about that piece. Let me pivot very quickly to the national security strategy. What are the U.S. government's national interests? Well, they boil down to security, of course, climate change and environmental protection, sustainable economic development, and international cooperation and governance. We as a military support these by maintaining enhanced presence to set the conditions, by regionally posturing forces, conducting exercises and operations, and along with the Navy, Marine, and Coast Guard team demonstrating our capabilities. We work to strengthen cooperative partnerships, partners with allies, NATO allies, the Arctic Council, the International Maritime Organization, to build shared awareness in that area. And we recognize that we need to modernize our infrastructure there, refueling and replenishing points, and of course, C5 ISR, including the ability to command and control and communicate in the high north. Those systems are not always as robust as we would like. So what are some of the partner and alliance equities? NATO's equities, the Arctic Council, the Organization for Security Cooperation in Europe, and the EU writ large. What's the role of the North Atlantic Treaty in the Arctic? I think we all can see that there's really no dedicated Arctic strategy or a collective approach that bridges all those organizations to address general security issues, which kind of leaves the security and defense matters to mostly Arctic states. So let me talk about Russia a little bit. What's Russia look like? They dominate the Arctic geography and possess the corresponding ability to dominate with capability and infrastructure. They do have legitimate sovereign interest, and they've elevated their northern fleet to constitute its own military district. So think a combatant command, if you will. They have the largest icebreaker fleet, can carry the Caliber cruise missile. They have an active defense system that has high readiness and mobility and firepower in the Northern Fleet. They've centralized the command and control authority with the S-400 missile system. They have strong anti-access and access denial capability that reaches from the Arctic to the Baltic to the GI-UK gap. They have long-range precision-guided strike weapons, especially focused near the Kola Peninsula. Caliber submarine launch land attack cruise missiles, the Kinzhal long-range anti-ship missile, the SSC-8 Screwdriver mobile land attack cruise missile. So there's a lot of firepower up in that region. The NATO northern flank with Norway, Sweden, and Finland, partnerships, capabilities, and integration are essential. So how about China? China has a near Arctic state Belt and Road initiative called the Polar Silk Road, and they seek to be essentially increase their influence through economic, diplomatic, scientific, and military activities. They play a larger role in shaping the regional governance in that now. They doubled their investments in mineral extraction, significant investments in the Russian Jamal liquefied natural gas joint venture, and to date have conducted over 12 deployments for what they claim scientific research. Our national defense strategy calls for strong integrated deterrence as a lever of national power. The Arctic Combatant Commander regions is a central point for NORTHCOM, INDOPACOM, and EUCOM, as the Unified Command Plan has intersecting seams in this region. Increasing access creates potential friction amongst the nations and the COCOMs in defining our roles and responsibilities. China and Russia challenge international norms and alter behaviors and with our allies and partners, and competitors are trying to militarize the Arctic, intend to infringe upon the freedom of navigation in the Northern Sea route. They're expanding and developing the region's infrastructure and increasing ability to place North America at risk. NORTHCOM tries to get after this to some extent with their Arctic Edge exercise series. In fact, in 2022, U.S. NORTHCOM and Canadian Air Forces did the biennial exercise to rapidly deploy and operate in the Arctic environments while defending North America. And lastly, let me briefly discuss our Blue Arctic strategy. There will be unified command implications as the polar ice cap melts to a contiguous Arctic Ocean. Enhanced presence, strengthened cooperative partnerships, and a more capable Arctic naval force will be necessary when this happens to promote peace and prosperity and stability when that ice cap melts. We must operate more assertively across the Arctic region to prevail in day-to-day competition. We must regionally posture naval forces, conduct exercises in operation, and synchronize Atlantic and Pacific fleet roles and responsibilities. We have to have integrated naval power in the Arctic littorals. And lastly, we need to strengthen our cooperative partnerships and integrated ops, especially with Canada, and we have to have enhanced maritime and polar ice cap domain awareness. And Admiral, with that, I'll pause and let you move to the next panel, sir.
Magnificent. Thank you very much for that intro, and a lot to digest there, and I know that our audience will have lots of questions for you at the end. Now we'll shift to Vice Admiral Dozier Dwyer. So Dozier, just a couple teasers for you, and then we'll turn you loose. You know, the second fleet that you command was laid to rest over a decade ago, and you're the second commander after we brought it back, which I think was brilliant. So why did we bring the second fleet back? And some people may not understand all the hats that you have, because you have a responsibility as NAV North, the naval component of NORTHCOM for Homeland Defense, as well as a responsibility to work with Naval Forces Europe on Joint Force Command Norfolk's responsibilities for safety and security in the Fourth Battle of the Atlantic. So how do you work together, you know, with all these different commanders like Daryl Cottle, General Van Herk, you know, the guys out there talking about the balloon, and Daryl out there rescuing the balloon, and then, of course, Stu Munch, who's over in Europe. And how do you do this in a manner that's collaborative when there can probably be some tension and people who want your forces, and you're pulled 6 different ways from sundown? You've got a reporting relationship up through the chain of command with Admiral Cottle, as well as a NATO commander through General Cavoli as the Supreme Allied Commander. So you got more bosses and more cell phones and more computers than anybody. And you've got an exercise coming up I'm excited about, because I love being the the guy in charge of Trident Juncture. You're going to do exercise Steadfast Defender, where you plan to leverage off the lessons learned from Trident Juncture, and I hope you'll tell us a little bit about that. Sir, over to you.
Well, thank you, Admiral Fogo, and thank you for inviting me to be here at the Wilson Center. It's great to share the stage with you, Admiral Cotter, Admiral Lundy, and our friends from the UK. As you said, it was an honor of mine, my very first flag assignment where I worked for you at Navier and worked for Admiral Cotter when he was the commander of Subgroup 8, and talk about setting the stage for my journey in the flag ranks. That experience working for two of the finest submarine officers and naval officers I've ever had the pleasure to work with has really prepared me for my current assignment, as you mentioned, as the commander of U.S. Second Fleet and Joint Force Command Norfolk. And so it's great to take a break from balloon recovery ops with Admiral Cotter and Admiral Lundy here to be here with you. But on a serious note, watching your men and women of the United States Navy and Coast Guard respond at a moment's notice to head the recovery effort of the balloon that the United States Air Force shot down over the weekend, to watch them spring to action and operate in a very challenging and demanding environment to recover this wreckage to support our decision makers and how we execute national policy. So great to share the stage and take a break with that. And thank you, Admiral Lundy, for all your help over the weekend doing that. As Admiral Cottle mentioned through his remarks at the strategic level, I'd like to share with you some of the things that you've asked me to share, Admiral Fogo, of the evolution of Second Fleet and JFC Norfolk and what it means, all in the context of deterring Russia in the high north and really establishing how we operate in the Arctic and the North Atlantic. Well, it's no surprise to anyone here that Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine has demonstrated that Russia is an actor that disregards international law, threatens our common values of freedom, democracy, and the rules-based international order. Stability that we enjoyed in the high north is in fact being challenged not only by climate change, but by Russia themselves. And at the same time, as Admiral Cottle had mentioned in his remarks, we see increased activity and interest by China in the Arctic. So let's rewind a little bit and let me show you why it is that I'm here with you today. And for the years leading up to 2011, the Atlantic was an area of low tension. The United States was focused on counterterrorism operations, and in doing so shifted a lot of our resources and our command structure towards the global war on terror. I remember as a commander and a captain getting underway from the East Coast of the United States. It was best speed through the Atlantic. There really wasn't much going on there. When we hit the Mediterranean, it was go directly to Suez Canal and then get into the Central Command area of operations and start supporting the global war on terror. There just wasn't a lot going on in the Atlantic and the Mediterranean leading up to 2011. And so because of that, shifting resources, the Second Fleet was disestablished in 2011. I got underway on the George Herbert Walker Bush to support the global war on terrorism. Second Fleet certified the George Bush, and when we came home at the end of that cruise, Second Fleet was no longer because it was an area of low tension. NATO had firmly shifted to out-of-area operations at the same time to prevent terrorist attacks against NATO nations in Europe. But starting in 2012, Russia resumed deploying its nuclear-powered land attack-capable submarines to the Atlantic and the Mediterranean. And as we all know, in 2014, Russia annexed the Crimea, demonstrating that Russia was determined to show that it remained a world power capable of projecting power at the time and place of its choosing. The Atlantic was quickly was quickly turning from an area of low tension to an area that garnered our attention. The Atlantic was no longer provided that buffer that we enjoyed in the Atlantic. It was no longer a sanctuary to the East Coast of the United States and North America. And to meet the changing security environment in the Atlantic and to match the re-emerging of this persistent proximate threat, the U.S. Second Fleet was reestablished in 2018. The Second Fleet not only retained its legacy area responsibility, Puerto Rico to the North Pole from 45 west longitude and westward if you drew a line from the point of Greenland southwards, that was the eastern limit of the legacy environment of the U.S. Second Fleet. But as I said, it was designed and brought back as a more agile and responsive fleet headquarters, able to maneuver from the Western Atlantic into the Eastern Atlantic, not only supporting Commander Naval Forces North America, my boss, Admiral Cottle, but also supporting the Commander of Naval Forces Europe, now Admiral Munch. A maneuver-numbered fleet headquarters built to be an agile and responsive maritime headquarters to move across the Atlantic at pace and scale to support national objectives. And at the same time, NATO was watching Russia deploy its undersea forces for North Atlantic operations, causing NATO to question the security of the transatlantic link. Focused for so long on out-of-area operations, NATO was returning to its core, 360-degree collective defense. And in that review, it was realized that the North Atlantic was the responsibility of Joint Force Command Brunson, a historically land-focused headquarters responsible for the effort in Afghanistan, as well as building up defenses on the eastern flank and the newly formed EFPs in the Baltic states. So in 2019, to meet the new threat to the transatlantic link, Joint Force Command Norfolk was established as an operational commander over NATO's Atlantic and Arctic, and the command would be dual-hatted with U.S. Second Fleet. So as Admiral Fogo says, I have two four-star bosses, Admiral Cottle in my hat as U.S. Second Fleet, and General Cavoli, the Supreme Allied Commander, Europe, in my NATO role. Now established at JFC Norfolk, we monitor Russia's activities in our area of responsibility. That is the North Atlantic and the High North. And in recent years, we have seen an increase in Russian Arctic military activity. Let me highlight some ways that we see this manifest itself. In July of last summer, 2022, Russia released its new maritime doctrine, prioritizing the Arctic as its most important maritime direction, pledging to protect these waters, quote unquote, by all means. This includes increased attention on the Arctic littorals, as well as the introduction of new missile capabilities, as Admiral Cottle highlighted, to focus on its bastion of the Northern Fleet. Now, this is very important. Prior to this announcement, the Arctic was their number 3 priority, where the Atlantic was their number 1 priority. Now, Russia has realized that the Arctic is the key to their economy and to their defense as they see the receding of the Arctic ice cap. In August of last year, Russia unveiled plans for a new strategic missile-carrying submarine cruiser for Atlantic operations. And moreover, in September, Russia conducted Exercise Umka in the Arctic, deploying several submarines together, showing their capability in the High North. And at the same time, as Admiral Cottle mentioned, the Northern Fleet was elevated to a district status, showing the emphasis Russia placed on the Arctic. It is also worth noting that Russia has renovated many Arctic sites and opened new ones, as Admiral Cottle mentioned in his opening remarks. This is why we at JFC Norfolk do everything in our power to manage and mitigate risks, prevent escalation, and ensure transparency of NATO operations in the Arctic. JFC Norfolk is, in fact, a critical element of NATO's adaptation and response to changing geopolitical readiness and realities, and it serves as a primary role in deterring actors that threaten the security of our citizens and values, and keeping lines of communication in the Atlantic and Arctic open and secure. Nested under SACEUR, JFC Norfolk delivers net deterrence effects at the operational level for the whole of the North Atlantic, from the Tropic of Cancer through the Arctic. Through our work with nations and other NATO commands, we are strengthening our interoperability and our ability to address these challenges. Further, pending the accession of Sweden and Finland into NATO, 7 of the 8 Arctic states will be NATO members. And in fact, NATO and Sweden already have close ties within the alliance, reflected by their long-standing close partnerships and interoperability with NATO. So to ensure that we remain ready for all conditions in all domains and to defend every inch of Allied territory from any threat, NATO forces and allies regularly conduct exercises to show not only our resolve, but our interoperability, and in many cases, interchangeability. And so I'd like to highlight just a few exercises that we have conducted through the NATO alliance in the high north. Last year, Cold Response 2022 was a Norwegian-led exercise testing allies and partners' ability to operate in the high north and northern Norway. Northern Viking 2022 was a U.S.-led maritime focus exercise based out of Iceland, concentrating on the defense of Iceland. ICEX 2022, as Admiral Cottle mentioned, brought the Royal Canadian Air Force and Navy and the UK's Royal Navy together with the U.S. forces, and the exercise involved a temporary ice encampment over 160 nautical miles away from shoal, with 2 operational fast attack submarines and 1 support team from Prudhoe Bay, Alaska. And coming up next month, we have Operation Joint Viking, another Norwegian-led exercise to show the multinational capability in Arctic conditions. And looking ahead to 2024, NATO will be carrying out what will be one of the larger exercises in recent years, Steadfast Defender 24. Well, JFC Norfolk will join with NATO to robustly execute transatlantic reinforcement of Europe from North America, as well as the defense of NATO nations to ensure territorial integrity. These exercises actually demonstrate the enduring transatlantic bond which lies at the heart of NATO. So exercising is one of the critical elements, but so is improving interoperability. And exercising with our NATO allies in the Arctic drives that interoperability. Just last fall, as a result of collaboration between JFC Norfolk, NATO's Combined Operations from the Sea Center of Excellence, and U.S. Navy commands, our Navy's newest carrier strike group, the Gerald R. Ford, exercised and demonstrated that NATO interoperability with our newest first-in-class carrier. This involved one of the largest groupings of Allied warships since the end of the Cold War, including ships from Canada, Denmark, France, Germany, the Netherlands, and Spain, sailing from Norfolk to the western shore of Europe and operating far from our shores here in North America to show that resolve and that interoperability between NATO nations. And finally, and it's not lost in this group, trust is based on relationships. At JFC Norfolk, we've been fortunate to both host key leaders, many of them are here in this room, and thinkers from across the alliance to determine and get after better ways to interoperate in the Arctic to achieve that collective defense NATO relies upon. So, Admiral, thank you very much for having me here today. In the question and answer, I'm happy to talk about the tactical levels of some of our exercises I mentioned here, as well as exercises we're having in our Canadian friends in the North, Operation Nanook, and some of the things we've learned from that. So thank you very much, sir.
Admiral, thanks so much, and you're absolutely right. Trust is based on relationships, and you're out there doing it, these exercises and real-world operations. And we've got 2 members of the Swedish and Finnish embassy who are my friends that I said hi to at the break, who are here with us today in solidarity, so it's fantastic. All right, we'll move on now to the United States Coast Guard. And in time of war, one team, one fight. We all go to sea together to defend this great nation. So Vice Admiral Kevin Lende, in your role as Commander Coast Guard Defense Forces East, you provide Coast Guard support as part of the Joint Force for the Department of Defense and the combatant commanders and our national defense missions. So if you could today, sir, tell us a little bit about the capabilities that are apportioned to Arctic missions under your command and what role the Coast Guard plays in deterrence in the Arctic. I know that we were a little bit jealous when I was over in Europe because actually the Coast Guard had a better relationship with Russia and China than we did. You're talking to them every day and all sorts of things like interactions on UN Convention on Law of the Sea, illegal activity in economic zones and territorial waters, illegal, unreported, and unauthorized fishing. And so, in this gray zone relationship with the Russians and the Chinese, if you can say anything about that, we know it's deteriorated, but would love to hear it. Also, I've got a picture here of the Polar Sentinel class polar security cutter. This is a magnificent ship under construction in a VT Halter Marine shipyard. It's going to be about $1 billion a copy, but it's well worth it because we have one icebreaker now to Somebody said earlier the Russians have 1,000. They actually have 54 to 56 and several nuclear-powered icebreakers. So how do you see the role of the Polar Security Cutter in enhancing the Coast Guard's ability and the nation's ability to operate in the Arctic? And, oh, by the way, I think Admiral Caudill mentioned, the Russians put Caliber cruise missiles on their icebreakers, like the Ivan Papanin, which I thought was ridiculous. So in response, are we planning on arming the Polar Security Cutter, and if so, with what? And finally, what are some of the biggest challenges you have in readiness? We're all having a problem in our industrial base and shipbuilding and modernization and readiness. I wonder if you'd be able to talk about that too in the time allotted. Sir, over to you.
Great. Thank you, Admiral Fogo. And it's great to be up here with Navy teammates and Admiral Remington from the United Kingdom, Royal Navy, and such an important topic. And certainly the first panel really set the mark. And Admiral Caudill, thank you for your introductory comments, sir. I think really helped us understand that when we talk about the Arctic, it's not just the strategic implications and the strategic context. It's actually the geography that's changing and very dynamic. Right? The Arctic is a new maritime frontier. Admiral Fogo, you talked about your experience, and when you surfaced again much later, suddenly there was a lot more blue and a lot less white.
Yeah.
And the Coast Guard, which operates in the Arctic frequently, has for over 150 years, we've observed the same thing. And the fact that now this new maritime frontier is increasingly navigable has its own strategic implications, and we see that at an operational level. Just to reset again, I think the Coast Guard, many of you know the Coast Guard is one of the 6 armed services in the United States, fully a part of the joint force we are every day. We not only conduct our operations, but support global combatant commanders and functional combatant commanders every day as part of the joint force. But we're unique in that we sit outside the Department of Defense. We're in the Department of Homeland Security with a unique set of authorities, not just as a military service, but a law enforcement agency, humanitarian agency, environmental protection role, and also critical infrastructure protection on the security side. And so that provides us, although we're not the largest, certainly, of any of the 6 military services in the U.S., we have a unique value proposition, a unique instrument of national security, including in the Arctic. And so I'd like to talk a little bit about that. Now, I have responsibility for the Atlantic area. The other side of the Coast Guard is the Pacific area. That's Vice Admiral Andy Tiongson, and his regional commander in the Arctic, in Alaska, is Rear Admiral Nate Moore. And so, of course, as we heard from the first panel, and you know well, the Alaska is the U.S. territory that sits north of the Arctic Circle in the Arctic region. The coastal regions, our own EEZ, U.S. EEZ up there as well. And so much of the balance of our operations actually happened under Vice Admiral Tiongson and Admiral Moore's command. And they conduct their own operations, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But they have a series of exercises that are continually ongoing in the U.S. Arctic on the Pacific side, in the Bering Sea, and then certainly in the Arctic proper, north of the Arctic Circle, and north of Alaska into the high north. In the Atlantic side, our responsibilities relate to the part of the Atlantic that borders the Arctic Ocean there, and our relationships with the other Arctic nations, Arctic states, is principally my responsibility without the territorial piece. And so we'll talk a little bit about the exercises there. Our role in the Coast Guard is to ensure sovereign presence in the Arctic region. We certainly don't do that alone, but in terms of sovereign surface presence, we carry the majority of the load. Since we operate the only U.S. icebreakers, that's not many, as Admiral Fogo said. We have 2 right now, one heavy, the Polar Star. She's 50 years old this year, but she continues to operate, very capable heavy icebreaker. And then the Coast Guard Cutter Healy, which is a medium icebreaker built in the 90s, principally operates in the Arctic for scientific research and scientific operations in partnership and for the National Science Foundation. And we do that every year. Healy was up there last year. The year before, sailed to the North Pole and has planned operations in the Arctic this summer as well. Polar Star's operations are reserved right now almost principally for Antarctica and our mission, national security mission, to the South Pole and McMurdo Station. But our role is to ensure that surface presence and promote and ensure U.S. sovereignty there and assured access to the polar regions on the surface. Now, this is not new. I said we've been doing this for 150 years. The U.S. Coast Guard was originally up there, the only federal presence in the Arctic out of Alaska, and we've operated there since then. This even included some high points for us in the 50s. You may remember the distant early warning line in the Cold War, and it was very difficult to resupply some of those the early warning line outposts. And 3 Coast Guard cutters actually transited the Northwest Passage, was the first U.S. effort to do that in 1957. And so we've operated up there. We have a lot of familiarity and operational experience there. So, sir, you've talked about you asked about our capabilities up there, and I'd like to talk about our capabilities, the Coast Guard capabilities, in 2 ways. One are the capabilities we probably think of first, and that's icebreakers or other capital assets like our Coast Guard cutters or aircraft or personnel that operate in the Arctic. And so we'll talk about that. And then the other, which is just as important, and it's also a matter of presence, maybe in a different way, and it's how we do maritime governance. It's the Coast Guard's role in engaging internationally with allies and with partners and like-minded nations through international organizations like the International Maritime Organization under the UN that Admiral Caudle described, where the U.S., along with the Department of State, leads the U.S. delegation to the IMO for a range of issues. Or it's our participation in regional fora for the Arctic, such as the Arctic Council, or the complementary body at the operational level, which is the Arctic Coast Guard Forum. So we'll talk about that as well. I mentioned the Polar Star and the Healy, our heavy and medium icebreakers, and we've continued to get great support and need great support from the administration and from Congress to sustain those aging assets. If they were to go down and not be able to be repaired in the winter off-season cycle, we would not be able to preserve and assure that surface access, both in the high north and also to McMurdo Station, those critical missions. At the same time, we have gotten the support necessary to begin to build the Polar Security class cutters, which will be the new generation of heavy icebreakers for the United States. Now, we've taken a different approach than we have in the past because Polar Security cutter itself by its name indicates we've taken a different approach that's more security-based. And so the acquisition is being run by a joint Coast Guard and Navy integrated program office. And so Naval Sea Systems Command actually is the lead, even though the Coast Guard will own and operate those icebreakers. And we're in partnership with Naval Sea Systems Command in that very important acquisition. It takes a long time to build icebreakers. It requires a lot of skill and specialty knowledge. And since we haven't built them in almost 40 years, it's taking time to get the detailed design right, the methods of construction and fabrication right, and so that work is important to be successful. It will be a very capable ship or class of ships when all 3 are constructed. The Polar Sentinel will be the first one. Right now, the contract delivery for that is 2025, sir. There might be a slippage. Admiral Gautier talked about this publicly late last year. It could slip into 26 or early 27. That's not been finalized. We're working very hard to bring that ship to the fleet and bring that important capability. In terms of armament, it will have armament sufficient for self-defense with space, weight, and power reservations for additional potential armament, and I won't describe that. That work is still ongoing, and we will adjust as the nation needs demand there. But I think it's important to keep in mind, regardless of the armament that the ships carry, the cutters carry, Coast Guard cutters under the command of a commissioned Coast Guard officer are at all times under international law warships, and regardless of their mission or where they're operating. And so that's important for U.S. sovereignty and presence as well. It's not just the icebreakers so that we operate up there. We also operate in ice-free areas with smaller cutters that are not ice-hardened, and we typically do that in the summer months. We'll talk a little bit about that. Certainly beyond cutters, aircraft, C5ISR systems that Admiral Caudle mentioned are also critically important for Arctic domain awareness, which is a responsibility we share with the Navy and others. Let me shift over to the maritime governance piece. And when I say maritime governance, think about it, if you will, as the sovereign duty of every maritime nation to do those things that are necessary for safety, security, and economic prosperity as a maritime nation, out to the edge of its exclusive economic zone, its contiguous zone and its territorial sea, as well as its responsibilities on the high seas. And so that's principally, we don't do it alone, but it's a large part of what the Coast Guard does below the level of certainly of military operations. And we do that in the Arctic. So it can involve, for example, in the International Maritime Organization, the Polar Code, which sets standards, and we were part of the negotiation of those standards, for ships to operate safely and with the right security, the right crewing, to be able to operate in the Arctic region. And that's an important part of reinforcing a rules-based order. We also do that through the regional forum like the Arctic Council. Examples are agreements in the last 10 years on cooperation on search and rescue, or cooperation on response to oil pollution events. Areas that we can find common interest and work at least cooperatively, communicate and work cooperatively where there's a need to do so. If you can imagine, as we've seen increasing activity in the Arctic, passenger vessels operating up there, sir, and if there is a mass search and rescue operation, that's clearly an area we need to be able to cooperate not only with our allies and partners, but also with Russia, if it's in an area of common concern. We conduct our own exercises, as I mentioned up there, and we do that each year, whether it's the Canadian-sponsored Op Nanook series, whether it's the exercise series that Denmark's Joint Arctic Command, Op Argus, and we do that with Second Fleet and clearly with Canada, Denmark, and other nations, Arctic nations, allies that have been involved in those. And we look forward to a reinvigoration of the Arctic Coast Guard Forum under Norway's leadership as they take to chair later this year, with planned exercises in 2023 that we look forward to participating in as well. And let me just finally finish, so you asked about our engagement with Russia and China.
Yeah.
I think I would be very deliberate in not choosing the word relationship with regard to our interaction and communication with the Russian Border Guard or China Coast Guard or other maritime agencies that we operate with. We have areas that we need to communicate with them, and we continue to do that. But we have not seen the level of interaction in a productive way that we've had in the past. And certainly the pause on activities in the Arctic Coast Guard Forum have reflected that. Maybe one way to think about this is an incident that Admiral Moore, under his command, happened it was a non-incident actually, but it was an example of the presence the Coast Guard is involved in. So in late September of last year, Coast Guard Cutter Kimball, a 418-foot national security cutter, was on patrol in the Bering Sea and encountered a Chinese PLA Navy vessel, the GMC Renhai CG-101 warship. They approached it, communicated with the warship, and found that it was operating in conjunction with the surface action group of 2 other PLA Navy vessels and 4 Russian Navy ships. The Coast Guard Cutter Kimball was the only U.S. warship on scene. They communicated with them, demonstrated a U.S. presence. The Russian and PLA Navy vessels did not act unprofessionally and dispersed. But it was important that the U.S. Coast Guard was there as part of the Joint Navy Marine Corps team to provide U.S. presence as part of the effort to make sure that it was understood that the U.S. was there. It was inside our own EEZ, about 75 nautical miles north of Kiska. So that's the kind of relationship and interaction that we have based on the relationship and the partnership we have not only as part of the joint force with our allies. I look forward to the questions. Thanks, sir.
Kevin, thank you very much. That was a really good rundown on Coast Guard and where you guys are and where you're going, and I'm glad you're on our team. Last but not least, Rear Admiral Anthony Remington, Royal Navy. Anthony, the Arctic has been a regional security interest for Great Britain since the early 20th century and a big focus of operations in World War II. It was a maritime front opposite the Soviet Union. I mean, we helped the Russians with the convoys to Murmansk, and you guys were part of that. And then we were on opposite sides of the Iron Curtain in the Cold War. So if you would today, among a couple of things, please treat how Great Britain and especially the Royal Navy view Arctic security in the present, because you've got a lot of missions tugging and pulling at you. Secondly, you know, after Trident Juncture in 2018, and coincidentally, just prior to Trident Juncture, this book came out by John Lehman, who's a great friend of the Center for Maritime Strategy. In fact, Dr. Wills wrote a recent book with John Lehman on carriers, the 21st century view of carriers. He had another one in the last century. He's been around for quite some time. This book is called Oceans Ventured, and I read it before I went up to the High North in June, before October, November. And I can remember as an ensign seeing Admiral Hank Muskin brief the 1986 maritime strategy and talk about how we were going to take our carriers, put them up over the Kola, and take the fight to the enemy. So that's why we had the Harry S. Truman. Now, once we were done with Trident Juncture, we said, okay, all the Americans and all NATO guys went home. So what are we going to do now? We have to maintain a continuous forward presence. We have to establish a new normal. So in the middle of COVID, we sent a 5-group surface action group to the Barents. That hadn't been done before since the Cold War. And the ships were USS Donald Cook, USS David Porter, USNS Naval Service Supply, a supply ship, a submarine who shall go unnamed because we are the silent service, a P-8 aircraft, and Her Majesty's ship, resupply ship, the Kent. You guys were with us. And so my question is, in light of that and establishing this new presence, are you still doing that? And are you still with us up in the high north and the Barents? Many nations are responding to Russia's operations in the Arctic. You know, how's the Royal Navy going to take this on in the future? And I'm not just talking about astute submarine deployments. And then finally, what would you like to see out of the Allies and the Americans? I mean, are we doing enough? Is it just about right, or are we not doing enough? Because you guys are over there in the middle of the fight. You're a lot closer to it with the GI-UK gap than we are. So, Anthony, over to you.
Sir, thank you. And I might start by saying I'm really grateful for the opportunity to speak. So thank you for the invitation. Thank you to the Wilson Center. I'm really grateful. The last time I was asked to speak on a panel in the US was about 25 years ago when I was, you mentioned being an ensign, sir, when I was a sub-lieutenant, so a Lieutenant JG. I was studying at university and was invited to take part in a conference in Annapolis. And the title of the conference was A World Without Borders. Because it was the mid-90s, and it was the heady sort of excitement of the post-Cold War era, where what we were looking at was new opportunities, and borders were falling, not being placed. And it's interesting to contrast, I think, where we find ourselves now. Many of the countries that we were reaching out to then are now allies and partners, and some of them, you know, very recently so. So that's an interesting point of contrast I just wanted to open up with. Second thing is to admit to a little bit of previous with this subject. So I am not an academic. In fact, I don't read widely enough. I don't read enough. It's something I'm always bullying myself about. But in 2010, I wrote my master's thesis. Interesting contrast with 2011, the date that you drew out, sir. I wrote my master's thesis on whether there was a role for NATO in the high north and the Arctic. And it was a really interesting thing to study. And I reflect on it often, actually, particularly given the subjects that we're reaching into now. People were generous with their time, particularly across Scandinavia, the US and Canada. But when I asked permission from the Ministry of Defense to speak to our Russian partners, even in 2010, I was not allowed to do so. So a little bit of history with the subject. You know, the UK is only a state observer of the Arctic Council. But we are the nearest neighbour of those observers and the status, and it's critical to our interests. And we're committed to its long-term security and stability. The strategic importance of the Northern Sea Route is not lost on us at all. As a you know, proudly maritime nation in our history, anything that shortens the trade routes by 14 days is significant, and so something that is really important to us. We've always advocated for peaceful international cooperation in the Arctic. Low tensions, as was talked about in the high north. It's been the status quo for many years, but it is changing. And Russian naval activity has been talked about already, is at levels that hasn't been seen for years. We do recognise that Russia is an Arctic state with significant interests and presence in the region, as others have already mentioned. And we recognise that it will seek to enhance these as the environment changes. But in doing so, we would want them to comply with international law, and particularly UNCLOS. Their December last year claim over waters out to 200 nautical miles from the northern coast and the demand that any transiting ship give 90 days notice, are both in contravention of UNCLOS, and we don't recognise. So the Royal Navy has, alongside our allies and partners, particularly the US, always sought to enforce and uphold those rules-based international, the rules-based international system, and freedom of navigation and operation with adherence to the UNCLOS is fundamental behind our approach to the region. Working together, I think we have the opportunity to accelerate the development of different capabilities that will assist us. And despite the melting ice, the High North will remain a deeply inhospitable place. to operate, whether it's new equipment, training, or technologies, particularly uncrewed and autonomous systems. Partnering with other nations allows you to bring the best out of individual capabilities as you look at it. Alliances and partners, I think, are important. You asked specifically about NATO, sir, and we'll return to that, no doubt, in questions. But the UK convened Joint Expeditionary Force has a particular focus on countries that fringe the Baltic, and particularly the northern side of the Baltic, and so has a role that I think is relevant here. You asked me a series of questions, sir, around particular UK takes on the Arctic as a region. And rather than just be suckered into giving a question that's based around capabilities and military capabilities at that, there were two documents I thought it was perhaps useful to bring to attention. So last year, the Ministry of Defence published a document that is called the UK Defence Contribution in the High North, signed out by our Secretary of State for Defence in December last year, which lays out how the Ministry of Defence will approach the Arctic and the High North as a region. Knowing as they did that the Wilson Centre was convening a conference today to talk about this subject, the UK government published a new document this morning in London, which I have a copy of here, which is called Looking North, the UK's Arctic Policy Framework. And I just thought it'd be interesting to read out the four key tenets of the cross-governmental UK approach, which starts with partnering and collaborating as the key tenet of the way the UK will approach the High North. It talks about protecting the climate, the people and environment as the second tenet, preserving security and stability as the third, and promoting our shared prosperity as the fourth. And I think if one looks to that document as the bedrock of the UK approach in the region, then it answers quite a number of the questions that you asked me up front, sir. So it was generous of Lord Goldsmith, who I think launched the document this morning, to do so at the time that he did, because it's helped me no end.
Well, it also goes to show how much influence Dr. Rebecca Pincus has in the United Kingdom.
It does that, sir. It does that. So your sort of second focused question was around, are we still doing it? And the First Sea Lord, Sir Ben Key,
great friend, yeah,
when he asked me to come and speak on his behalf here today, sir, he would have me point out to you the way that he divides up the Royal Navy's activity when he looks at the world. And it's into four buckets, effectively. And the first of those is retaining operational advantage in the North Atlantic. It's the most important task that we have put on us by the country. And it's not only because we're responsible for maintaining the UK's nuclear deterrent, and we do that in the North Atlantic, but it's also because we recognise that retaining presence in the North Atlantic is one of the key ways of changing behaviours and re-establishing norms. So I think that's the most important part of doing it, because that indicates that when we come to decide where we're going to use the Navy's resources, the North Atlantic is the place we think about first. And it's therefore the place that you can expect to see most Royal Naval activity. And I think our current ministerial group would absolutely endorse a focus on the Euro-Atlantic and Arctic region as being the place that they expect to see UK armed forces engaged first before other regions. And it's interesting that in the first session this afternoon, you were talking about military norms and how you establish military norms as a form of deterrence. And I think the UK would see a way of doing that is through presence and using the area as our backyard, as indeed it is, and operating with northern NATO nations in particular, but not exclusively. And that being one of the ways that we reinforce what we consider to be the rules-based international system. And if you think of governance, the documents that I've referred to already, I think that adds weight through presence. And policy and priorities, such as the reference to Admiral Ben's words that I just gave you. The other thing that leapt out from the first session, I think, is to do with strategic communications. It's also about telling people what it is you're doing and where you're doing it. And the picture that you were referring to, sir, of the 5-ship SAG, the photograph is what makes that and is what gives it its weight. So we should always, as we know when planning operations, think about the message you're trying to land when we do it. And I think that's going to help us to reinforce. We talked about seabed capabilities and the importance of critical national infrastructure. Our Norwegian colleague was talking to that in the first session. And I think agility when it comes to procurement of new capabilities is key as well. The UK has gone to the market in the last year and bought what we're describing as a multi-role ocean surveillance platform from the open market, an undersea capabilities vessel, which is undergoing modification in Plymouth at the moment before it goes to sea under a Royal Naval flag. And that was flash to bang in 10 months. The requirement was identified, the fact that it was urgent enough that we needed to go to the commercial market to buy the ship rather than wait for the normal naval procurement system to come into effect. And I think that agility is key to responding to the threats that you see in the region and doing something about it.
That's awesome. I mean, you broke the acquisition paradigm in this country, that's for sure. 10 months.
Yeah, there was a certain amount of blood spilt in the UK as well, sir. But in buying capabilities, we should also remember that people and training are key to delivering on those capabilities. So again, reaching out to partners, working with particularly those with particular skills, such as US Coast Guard who operate in this region, Canadian allies as well, who've got great experience in this area. That's the thing that's really going to allow you to unlock those capabilities even once you've procured the kit. And so, the skills that allow you to operate, sir, with un-ice protected vessels in the high north when the conditions allow, that's really the leverage you need to be able to use existing capabilities. You were asking about the armaments you might want to see
Sure.
on a polar specialist vessel. Well, maybe actually it's the skills of the people who can take ships that are already armed in that way to where we might not have taken them in the past that is perhaps important to unlocking.
Daryl and I think we should put torpedoes on the Polar Sentinel there. But that's our opinion.
So I hope that's sufficient.
That's
I'll leave it
fantastic,
there.
Anthony, I'll tell you. And for a guy who hasn't given a speech in 25 years, that was extremely eloquent and also in the Queen's English. So you did a great job. And, I'll give you, since you're a newly minted flag officer, I'll give you the same advice that Admiral Mullen gave me when he tacked on my first star, and that was, now as an admiral, you will never again have another bad meal as long as you wear that uniform, and nobody will ever tell you the truth again either. So you got to figure that out when the staff comes in and tells you how good looking you are. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we've got about 15 minutes for questions. I've got a bunch that I can ask, but I want you to have the opportunity to ask questions. And our French colleagues, sir, you got the first one.
Thank you very much. After abusing the director and chair panel, I'll abuse the co-panelist prerogative. I have probably 100 questions, but I'll keep it to 2 if that's possible. Admiral Dwyer in particular, and to all the panel, this is a question I asked your predecessor, Admiral Lewis, actually. Does NATO need an Arctic strategy, a proper dedicated Arctic strategy? If not, what should we do to make sure that we keep eye and ears in the region? And the other question I alluded to during my presentation, the phone-up issue. If Russia is really believing that we will conduct at some point a form of freedom of navigation operation to contest their internal waters or what they understand as internal waters, what should we respond in terms of the communication strategy behind it? Are we doing one? Are we not doing one? And if so, what could that look like? And what are we trying to prove there? Thank you very much.
Those are excellent questions. Admiral Cottle, would you like to go first, or would you like to delegate to anybody else in the room?
I'll let Admiral Dwyer take that. I won't speak to the NATO and the Arctic strategy one. I will talk generally, really quick, about FON operations. Freedom of navigation operations within the United States is a process by which we deliberately decide the areas to conduct those operations. And generally, the communication of that FON operation is through the actual operation itself. And so if that were to be done, that's how we would communicate that. It would be through conducting routine, deliberate, demonstrative operations in area that we believe should be free and open and not necessarily claimed by Russia. So I'll leave it at that and let Dan talk to the other pieces. Over.
Well, thank you for your question, and kind of following up what Admiral Fogo talked about never having a bad meal. as a flag officer, and everyone tells you the God honest truth. What I like to say is, what I do is it's pounds for peace for me. And I eat for my country, and I eat for my NATO alliance, and we call it pounds for peace. And I certainly am exhibiting that policy. But specifically, should NATO have a strategy for the Arctic? Well, it's such a small portion of the Arctic would be considered the NATO Arctic, and I refer to it as the NATO Arctic, and that is traditionally the islands around Svalbard, Greenland, up to the Canadian Arctic, and not including the Canadian Arctic. So it's a small area. So we've talked about this, whether we need a focused strategy just for this small piece of territory, though it's very expansive. But when you consider the Arctic in totality, it's just a slice of it. So NATO's approach is NATO is a defensive alliance, a consensus-based alliance of 30 NATO nations, and it's now, as I mentioned, we were focused on out-of-area operations and operations in Northern Africa, Iraq, Afghanistan, now coming back to this 360-degree collective defense. And the underlying term there is 360 degrees. And so the NATO alliance is focused its operations to fulfill that collective defense requirement by having forces and exercises and operations that solely focus on that collective defense. And so as we see, when we look as a Joint Force Commander, looking at the operations and exercises that happen in my AOR, 85% of those operations and exercises are nationally led. Really only 15% of them are under the NATO banner. But Russia views everything as a NATO exercise and operation. And so my job as the commander of Joint Force Command Norfolk is connect with the nations, connect with those national joint headquarters, and have a good understanding of national exercises and operations so I can fuse that together into an overall net deterrence effect that it is having against would-be adversaries towards NATO, and provide that back to the Supreme Allied Commander of, hey, this is our net deterrence effect in the Arctic. Because NATO obviously is a voluntary contribution for forces, and no one is going to undermine a sovereign right to exercise their navy and their land forces as they see fit. But as they do that, I as a Joint Force Commander work with those nations and then provide that up to SACEUR, so he has an overall view of what is the overall net deterrence effect we're having in my AOR, particularly the Arctic. And I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, it should be also added that when the Russians came out with the policy, their policy on the Northern Sea Route, that was on my watch when I was the 4-star in Europe, and these guys were with me. So 45 days notice, you must use 2 Russian pilots on the bridge of a warship or any other ship. You must be escorted by at least 2 or 3 Russian icebreakers, and you have to pay a fee. And so when that edict came out, I made a public statement, strategic communications, and it went to the press. Hey, we're not going to do that. We will not be deterred by any nation to operate, freedom of navigation, transit, passage in accordance with UN Conventional Law. See, some guy in the Russian Duma, either that, a real guy or a fake guy, a troll or bot, came back because I said it's not a Russian lake and just blew up, and made threats and allegations. It should be noted that the United States of America is an equal opportunity fawner. So we fawn our allies as well as our adversaries. And I can tell you, in our headquarters, we had national military representatives from all the allies. Sometimes we do a fawn op, and you find out about it when they see the American warship driving along this baseline, which we don't observe. It's 12 miles from NAM, not some baseline across a cove. And they come into your office and they go, hey, I thought we were friends. We are friends, but we're going to operate under UNCLOS, and we don't believe in baselines. So there. And, sometimes that's hard for people to swallow. Great question. Thank you. Anybody else? Kim. Kim is our Airbus rep. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for the invitation. So the DoD Arctic strategy, one of the pillars was to increase the domain awareness or the situational awareness in the Arctic. So besides, the improvement of C2 capabilities in the northern latitudes, what is your vision of improved maritime domain awareness? What do you need? What do you think would be helpful for you to better plan and react to the situation in the Arctic region?
Admiral Lande, would you like to take that?
Sure, and I'll speak more to the Coast Guard has an Arctic strategy that nests underneath the Department of Homeland Security strategy on the security side. It's very complementary to the DoD strategy. I would, and the national strategy for the Arctic region that Admiral Caudle talked about, released last year. I would say for domain awareness, it's really a combination of capabilities that we're talking about. And I think although it may be natural to sort of start and say, well, that must mean we need ISR, and that's what domain awareness is about. And that's certainly a critical part of it. But it actually involves physical presence in multi-domain ways too. MDA probably has a cyber and space, it certainly has a space component. It certainly has a cyber component as well, because of the connectivity of the physical and space domain to the logical domain. And so I think there's a number of ways that domain awareness, in my view, it's a very broad concept that includes physical presence, surface, subsurface, probably crewed and autonomous systems as well. Whatever the capabilities necessary, not just from a U.S.-only perspective, but with allies and partners, to be able to sustain our sovereign interests there and our collective security. So I think a broad reading of that is how I interpret it from the different policy documents and the national policy that's out there.
Anybody else?
I think Admiral Caudle, were you?
Hey, Jamie, I would just foot stomp what Admiral Lundy said about it is about the presence. It's not just national technical means, ISR, partners. If you don't build the domain awareness with actual presence, then to what end does the awareness actually do anything? You have to be able to respond. And so the presence gives you both. It gives you the awareness and the ability to respond. So I think any increase in domain awareness will have to come with of course, an increase in what we have there in a presence manner. Over.
Yeah, absolutely, Daryl. I couldn't agree with you more. Virtual presence equals actual absence. Flying airplanes or balloons over the Arctic is only ephemeral, but naval forces are there in permanence because they turn over to other naval forces. So thanks for that.
Can I add something, Admiral?
Yeah, go ahead.
So another thing that's really important to realize is there's a lot of great capability out there. And what are the information sharing agreements we have between the various organizations? We think information sharing between nations, but there's a lot of times we have information agreement issues within our own government. Or we build a system that doesn't talk to another system. This is a lot what JADC2 is trying to get after, a common way to communicate, to provide that situational awareness, multi-domain, space, cyber, on the sea, undersea, and in the air. And then do we have those information sharing agreements? That's just something I face in NATO all the time is, we try to bust through our caveats, our national caveats, and our classification systems to share this information. The information's there that we need. How do we better share that information?
Yes, sir. Could you get him a mic, please?
Thank you very much. Michael Keyes from the Kennan Institute. Building on this, I'm wondering if there's a public-private partnership aspect to this. I'm thinking about the Marine Exchange up in Alaska and their efforts to basically get commercial buy-in to respond to incidents in the Bering Sea, for instance. I mean, could that be extended? Could we even try to offer that as some sort of form of, cooperation or whatever you want to call it with Russia, so that all the vessels they have on their side of the Bering Straits, right, could be involved in that as well?
Well, I think certainly for the Coast Guard activities, we work with industry on a regular basis. That's part of our bread and butter. And whether it's maritime safety or security issues, including in the Arctic region, as to whether or not there's an opportunity for that type of public-private relationship that we have to work with regards to Russia or China, I think is a tougher question, given the relationships of those industries typically with the state. But, we heard in the first panel, Mr. Coffrin talk about space as a unique area where there's opportunity. And certainly the maritime domain up in the Arctic is not space. But it does offer potential opportunities using existing structures and international fora to explore on areas of common interest that we can find shared value, like response to a mass rescue operation if a passenger vessel were to get into distress, or countering illegal fishing that violates international law. Those are areas where we might find opportunities for collaboration, not only with private companies and industry, but also increasingly with our other strategic competitors.
Thank you. Becca, do we have time for one more? Yeah, okay. Dr. Wills.
Hey, first, sir, thank you very much for the book shout-out. I have no doubt that the ghost of Vice Admiral Mustin is happy that the Second Fleet is back out there again and doing the kind of things that he used to do with it. Let me ask, gentlemen, for a moment, a question about unmanned systems. So Admiral Lunde and Admiral Remington both mentioned unmanned systems. A lot of the experimentation that we've seen with unmanned systems has taken place in other places. So in the Persian Gulf with Task Force 59, and in the Indo-Pacific with the latest RIMPAC exercise. Can any of you gentlemen speak about where you would like to specifically see unmanned systems in any testing and where it would fit within your overall engagement in the region? Thank you.
Admiral Remington, take that one.
Yeah, definitely. We'd like to see them in the North Atlantic, and the further north the better. So without talking specific details, there is a role for remotely piloted autonomous systems, either in the surface, under the sea, or indeed for air and aviation systems as well. So all domains, we are keen to see them exploited. When it comes specifically to the question of the Arctic, it's just a natural extension of programs that we already have running. But the answer, I think, is simple. We would see all domains in the North Atlantic being suitable for that exploitation.
Admiral Landy, any?
Well, I think it offers opportunity we need to be looking at, and I think the work that Admiral Cooper is doing and the team in Task Force 59 certainly has potential applications in any of the maritime areas, and so we're watching that and participating in it very closely, including our unit that's out in Bahrain, 6 Coast Guard cutters and a lot of Coast Guard personnel that are there full-time working for Admiral Cooper. And we're part of those Task Force 59 operations. And so we're going to draw some of those lessons that'll help inform a future Coast Guard UXS strategy as well.
So the Surface Navy Association, and my hat's off to Admiral Cottle because he leads a joint organization of all different kinds of boutiques in the Navy. You got the aviators, you got the surface guys, you got Marines, you got Navy guys, you got support people, intelligence people. And as submariners, we wear these gnarly green wool sweaters. Aviators get brown flight jackets. The SWOs now have a black jacket, and Darrell wears his around his headquarters there in solidarity with the Surface Warriors. They had a great conference. Brad Cooper, Vice Admiral Cooper, one of the most eloquent fleet commanders out there, came and talked about Task Force 59. It was eye-watering what we're doing with unmanned systems, but not just the systems, on the surface, under the surface, in the air, the network that joins them together. And this is 80% of the Allies, 20% U.S. The CNO came in after Admiral Cooper gave his pitch, and he did a presentation. Somebody asked him a question, so are you satisfied with Task Force 59 and what's going on there? Heck yes. And I'm looking to move that model, to another theater of operations, TBD. We don't know where that is. Certainly the Arctic could be one, the Atlantic could be another, the Pacific. But I think unmanned is going to be a bona fide piece as we look to husband resources and manned platforms in the future of all naval and Coast Guard operations. So that is a wrap, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for our 1,000 online listeners. Sorry we couldn't get you to ask a question, but I think the team here in the room did a great job. And I have one last thing I'd like to do. One, I offered two books, Steve's book on carriers, The Oceans Ventured. I just finished reading at Newport, which I know Dr. Pincus, Dr. Peterson have been up there at the War College. We've put out the Arctic Security Newport Manual on Arctic Security. It's really good by Walter Burbick, Gail Rivard-Pichet, another French person, and Michael Zimmerman. And if you haven't read The Battle of the Atlantic by Magnus Nordeman, our friend, he came over and wrote this thing while we were all in Europe together, and there's one chapter dedicated to the Fourth Battle of the Atlantic and what Naples does in the undersea domain. Great book. Lastly, I would like to just thank our participants. And I know, Daryl, I said virtual presence is equal to actual absence. I have a coin for you, but it's a virtual coin for you. And the coin is from the Center for Maritime Strategy. It has the Trident for Sea Power, the book in the background of the Academy, ACADEME. And then the Marines have a Semper Fi as their model, always faithful. The Coast Guard, Semper Paratus, always ready. So I needed a Semper on my coin. Mine is Semper Invictus, always undefeated, because naval forces will never lose a battle to an adversary at sea, as long as I'm alive, and these guys are in charge. Well done, gentlemen. And Rebecca, I have
Jamie.
one for you too, if you wouldn't mind coming.
Jamie, I'll just say that I'll get my coin when I come and help christen your wine cellar. How about that?
Sounds good. That's what you do in retirement. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Anthony. Thanks, Enjoyed your remarks. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Great job.